The Gospel of Mark is almost no one's favorite gospel. If we were to go around the room today and ask, and don't worry, we're not going to do that, but if we did, I'm pretty sure that most everyone here who has a favorite gospel would say that it was either Luke or John, though perhaps a few of the contrarians among us might speak up for Matthew. But I suspect that very few of us, if any at all, would say Mark. And there's a reason for that. For the fact is, Mark is just not particularly well written. Indeed, there are very few passages in the Gospel of Mark that wouldn't have benefited from a good editor, which is, in effect, what both Matthew and Luke were. Simply versions of Mark that have been reworked by people who could actually write. So among the evangelists, the four evangelists, Mark generally gets credit for having been first, for being the inventor of the gospel format, but beyond that, for very little else. So little credit, in fact, that one seriously wonders how Mark even made it into the New Testament. I mean, once you had Matthew and Luke, why did you really need Mark? And it's a very real question. There are all kinds of problems that people have with Mark, but none of them are as large as the problem they have with his account of the resurrection, the passage I read for you just a few moments ago. The problem is how the story ends, if in fact it actually does end that way, which is not at all clear. Indeed, for years and years, it was just assumed that the actual ending of the gospel, at least the original ending of the gospel, must somehow have gotten lost. Since what remains, what you heard me read this morning, ends so abruptly. So abruptly, the thinking goes, that no one could have possibly ended the gospel that way on purpose. And if you look back at that final verse in the Gospel of Mark, you'll see exactly what they're talking about. And just in case you don't remember it, this is how it goes. So they went out, the women, they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's it. That's how the gospel ends. And it's not a matter of translation either, that somehow the English just comes across more truncated than does the original, which is not the case. The original Greek is actually even worse than the English. In fact, the English version has been smoothed out to make it sound better than the original does. So think about it. What if Mark's was the only gospel we had? The only account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ? What would Easter be like if Mark was all we had? I mean, here in Mark's gospel, no one actually sees the risen Lord, not at the tomb or anywhere else. The disciples are nowhere to be found. None of them makes an appearance in Mark's account. Not Peter, not John, none of them. Why, even the faithful women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome, the ones who actually discovered the empty tomb, they are said to have been so terrified by what they found that they told no one about it. Told no one that they'd found the tomb empty. Which is then how the gospel ends. Well, the ending is so abrupt and frankly unsettling that very early on several attempts were made to provide a new ending to the gospel, on the assumption that the original must have been lost, that no one could actually have intended to end the gospel like that. So they wrote new ones. A couple of them, actually. And if you have an older version of the Bible, it probably has one of those new endings in it. Actually, our pulpit Bible has both new endings in it, even though every biblical scholar of any repute at all knows that those weren't original. Interesting little aside, one of those new endings contains the claim that in the days after the resurrection, the apostles received power to handle poisonous snakes without harm, which is where those groups that still do that as part of their worship get their warrant for that practice. So how'd you like to be handling a rattlesnake and somebody come up and tell you, hey, you know, that's not really in the Bible? So what are we to make of all this? This gospel that ends so abruptly. This gospel that leaves us hanging, wondering why anyone would end the story like this. No doubt were either the Gospel of Matthew or Luke to end this way, to end so abruptly, it would suggest that something was probably wrong. Because they don't do anything like this anywhere else. But that's not so obviously the case with Mark, who not just here, but on several other occasions, leaves us hanging in much the same fashion. In fact, it's not too much to say that Mark is a gospel of loose ends, a gospel that many times leaves us practically begging for further explanation. As those of you who were here last Sunday may remember, I pointed out that Mark's account of the events on Palm Sunday differs from both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke in one very significant way, and does so in a way that actually raises more questions for us about just what it was that happened that day than it answers. And again, then, leaves us scratching our heads, wondering what's going on. Later in the week, after the Passover meal Jesus shared with his disciples in the upper room, right in the middle of this very dramatic story of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's this strange little incident involving a young man who appears completely out of the blue, no explanation whatsoever who he is, and then he runs off into the night stark naked. We don't know who it is. Why does Mark tell us something like that? And again, leaves us wondering, who was that? What's going on? And finally, at the cross itself, in Mark, one of the Roman soldiers there blurts out, truly this man was the Son of God. A claim so astonishing, certainly from a Roman soldier, that both Matthew and Luke back off from it. Matthew leaving it out entirely, and Luke toning it down to merely a declaration of Jesus' innocence, not a confession of faith, which presumably just didn't make any sense to Luke. But even then, after making this astonishing claim about this soldier's confession of faith, Mark says nothing more about the soldier, leaving us once again to wonder, whatever happened to that guy? What's going on? Because time after time, Mark leaves us wondering, leaves us with what feels like an unfinished story. A story that practically cries out for some closure, for someone, anyone, to finish the story. But far from that being a sign of Mark's ineptitude as an author, I have a feeling that this actually might have been Mark's intention all along. May have been the way, actually, that Mark had been telling this story for years, before he ever finally got around to sitting down and putting it all on paper. In fact, I'd be willing to go so far this morning as to say that Mark may well have ended the gospel in the way he did, precisely so that his readers would have to finish the story themselves, would have to provide an ending to the gospel. An ending, though, not about what happened to Mary Magdalene and the other women there at the tomb, or what happened to the disciples hiding back in the upper room, or about the Roman soldier or Joseph of Arimathea, but about what happened to you. To you. And how and when it was you encountered the risen Lord, and how his resurrection changed your life. Because for Mark, the end of the story of the resurrection didn't take place at a tomb outside the city of Jerusalem, or in an upper room, or even alongside the Sea of Galilee. Because the story of the resurrection continues, and it continues in your life, and in your life, and in your life, and in my life. It continues because, as Mark knew full well, the story of the resurrection never ends.